I was standing 3 feet away when it happened, Marin told the council, her voice steady even though her hands were not. I saw her face change, not the way a wolf changes, the other way, the way a woman changes when she finally understands what she is. Marin's has a scar that runs through her left eyebrow, splitting it in two. She'd earned it at 16, in a border skirmish she never talked about. She'd been a witness to 100 things in her life. She said afterward that this was the only one she'd carry to her grave. She was talking about Leodon. They all were, by the end. Here is what I know about growing up wrong. Not broken, wrong. There's a difference, and Leodon learned it early, the way children learn the things that will define them. By accident, in front of an audience, with nowhere to hide. She was 6 years old the first time the pack ran without her. 6. And already she understood that the absence of something could be louder than a scream. The other children shifted on the hillside above Dunrath. That particular hillside, where the heather grew in dense purple mats and the wind always came from the east. And she stood among them in the last gray light of evening and waited for what was supposed to happen. The feeling of splitting, the feeling of becoming. The second self that every member of the Dunrath pack carried inside them like a second heartbeat. Constant and warm and present, nothing came. The children around her dropped to their knees and their bones rearranged themselves with the sounds that always made her stomach turn. That wet crack and slide of a body remaking itself. And then they were gone, all of them, bolting down the hillside on 4 legs, in a cascade of brown and gray and tawny gold. Her best friend Senna's black-tipped tail disappeared into the tree line. The pack elder who supervised the children's first runs stood at the edge of the clearing with his hands folded behind his back. And he watched her. And he said nothing. Elder Croft. He was 73 years old, and he had a way of being still that most people mistook for patience. His eyes were the color of river water, pale and shallow and cold. He watched her stand alone on the hillside, with her hands balled into fists at her sides. And she looked back at him. And something passed between them that she could not have named at 6, that she would not have words for until she was 26, and it was far, far too late. He already knew, he had always known. But that night, all she knew was that she was wrong. All she knew was that the pack had run, and she had not, and the heather pressed against her ankles, and the wind came from the east, and the sound of wolves howling in the valley below rose up like a tide, like something she could drown in if she let herself. She did not let herself. This is the first thing you need to understand about Leodon. She did not let herself. She had pale hair, the color of birch bark in winter, that silver-white blonde that looks almost gray in low light, and it hung in a single braid down her back, always. Because loose hair caught in things and she could not afford to be caught. She had her mother's hands, wide-palmed, strong, the hands of someone built for work rather than ceremony. She had a small crescent scar at the base of her right thumb from a knife-slipping accident when she was 11. And the scar had a slight raised ridge to it that she touched sometimes without realizing, the way you touch the thing that changed you. She grew up knowing what she was, the wolfless one, the gap in the pack, the child who stood on the hillside and waited and felt nothing, and who learned, slowly, over years, through a discipline so thorough it became invisible, to build a life in the space the wolf should have occupied. She became useful instead. Specifically, profoundly, unmistakably useful. She learned the medicinal properties of 63 plants that grew within a day's walk of Dunrath. She learned to read weather in the way the pack's wolves couldn't. They smelled it coming. She watched for it, the particular quality of light before a hard frost, the way rooks gathered in oak trees before rain. She learned to negotiate with the village traders who were nervous around wolves, because she did not smell like a wolf, and they trusted her the way they trusted something they recognized. She became the thing her pack needed that they couldn't provide for themselves. She was good at it. She was genuinely, specifically good at it, and she knew it, and it was not enough, and she knew that too. "You're more valuable than any of them," her mother told her once, when she was about 14, and the ache of it had sharpened into something that lived in her chest like a splinter. Her mother's name was Bryn, and she had the same silver-white hair, the same wide hands, and she could shift into a wolf the color of moonlight. She said it kindly. She said it the way mothers say things that are true but not sufficient. "You're different. Different isn't less." Liadan looked at her and did not say what she was thinking, which was, "Then why does it feel like less?" She said, "I know, ma'am." She was 26 the spring the Alpha King came to Dunrath. The valley had known about it for 2 weeks before he arrived. Runners sent ahead, his herald's seal on the message, the kind of formal notice that meant something important was about to be decided. The Dunrath pack was not large. 300 wolves, a good portion of them elderly or young. They held useful territory. The valley controlled 2 mountain passes and several streams that fed the lowland farms, and they'd managed the passes fairly for 4 generations, which was the kind of unglamorous competence that packs either built legacies on or took for granted. Eldercroft took nothing for granted. He'd managed the pack's politics with the same quality of stillness he'd shown on that hillside 20 years ago. A careful, patient management of who knew what, who held what levers existed and where. He was not a cruel man. He was a precise one, which in Liadan's experience was often more dangerous. He called her to his study 2 days before the king's arrival. The room smelled of old paper and the particular resinous smoke of the oil he used in his lamp, pine resin, something she'd always associated with him, with the particular quality of attention he paid when something mattered. He sat behind his work table, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her, with that still, measuring quality, and he said, "You'll attend the presentation ceremony." "Of course," she said. She always attended ceremonies. She was pack. Wolfless or not, she was pack. "You'll stand with the outer ring." She held his gaze. The outer ring was where the unmated subordinates stood. The young ones. The ones of least political consequence. She was 26, and she managed the pack's trade relations and half their medicinal knowledge. She was not a subordinate. She was not politically inconsequential. She was, in the politics of their pack, something that did not have a clean name, too valuable to ignore, too anomalous to place. "I see," she said. "It's appropriate," Croft said. He folded his hands on the table, that familiar gesture, patient and final. "Given your nature." Your nature. Her wolflessness, her wrongness, placed neatly back in its box, she said. "Yes, Elder." She left. In the corridor outside his study, she stood very still for a moment and pressed the pad of her thumb against the scar at its base and breathed through her nose. The hallway smelled of cook smoke and beeswax and the faint cold air coming in from the high windows. She counted her breaths. 4 in, hold, 4 out. A thing she'd learned at 12 from the pack's old healer, who had understood, without ever saying so directly, that there were things Liadan needed to manage that other pack members did not. She went back to work. She had a list. The trade negotiations with the eastern villages needed reviewing before the king arrived because border territories often shifted their obligations during formal visits, and she wanted Dunrath's position documented clearly. The medicinal stores needed an inventory because the previous winter had been hard, and she suspected they were low on fever root. There was a family in the lower valley whose youngest child had been coughing for 3 weeks, and Liadan had promised to stop by. She did all of it. She did it thoroughly and without complaint, because this was what she had, and she was not a woman who let what she had go to waste. The day the king's party crested the eastern pass, the whole pack gathered at Dunrath's gates. She stood in the outer ring. She was aware of Senna 3 ranks ahead of her. Senna, her oldest friend, who'd grown into a senior hunter and mated young, and had 2 children, and a laugh that could be heard across the valley. Senna turned once and found her in the crowd and made a face that meant, "This is ridiculous," and Leodin returned a small, composed smile that meant, "Yes, I know, it's fine." It was not fine. She had learned to carry things that were not fine as if they weighed nothing. The king's party came through the gate and the pack made the formal sounds of welcome, a ripple of bows, the structured silence of deference. And she joined in, correct in every gesture, standing in the outer ring where Croft had placed her. She noticed the king's horse first, a dark bay with one white fetlock, moving with the careful, collected step of an animal well-trained and perfectly trusting of its rider. Then she looked at the rider. Vale, Alpha King of the 7 Packs, ruled from the high seat at Caer Moran, which she'd never seen but had heard described in terms that made it sound like a small, cold city, built mostly of ambition. He was not what she'd expected. She'd expected the architecture of dominance. The way powerful men in her experience tended to take up more than their actual physical space. The aggressive broadness, the look that said, "Everything here is already mine." He had some of that. He was tall in the saddle and broad-shouldered in a way that was factual rather than performed, and he held himself with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent a long time being looked at and had simply stopped thinking about it. But his eyes, when they moved across to the gathered pack, were doing something she recognized. They were reading. Not assessing, not cataloging threat. Reading, the way she read trade documentation, looking for what wasn't said. He had a scar along his jaw, clean and old, running from the corner of his mouth to the point of his chin. She would later learn its origin. She did not know it yet. He dismounted, and Croft moved forward, and the ceremony began. The presentation ceremony for an Alpha King's formal visit was 12 steps long, and she knew all of them. She'd helped write the documentation of the protocol 3 years ago, when the old records were found to be incomplete. She stood in the outer ring and watched each step proceed with the precise efficiency of a ritual that had been practiced to the point of unconscious competence, and she thought about fever root and trade margins and the child in the lower valley, and she kept herself very firmly in the outer ring in every sense that mattered. She almost succeeded. It was step 9, the elders' presentation of pack members of significance, where Croft began the individual introductions, moving through the inner rings, the senior hunters, the seconds and thirds, and she registered with a thin, familiar quality of feeling that her name would not be called. She was right. He moved through the rings, methodical, and her name was not called. And then step 9 ended, and step 10 should have begun, the formal acknowledgement, the king's words of reception, and instead a pause fell over the ceremony, the kind of pause that doesn't happen in well-practiced rituals, and she looked up from the middle distance she'd retreated into. The king was not looking at Croft. He was looking at her. Not the aggressive look of power. Not the look of someone cataloging a person as a threat or an asset. The reading look. The look she'd recognized when he arrived. He was reading her across the distance of the gathered pack, and his eyes had stopped moving, and she felt, peculiarly, distinctly, that he had found something he hadn't expected. "You've missed someone," Vale said. His voice carried without apparent effort. It was a voice accustomed to being heard over things. Croft's stillness acquired an edge. "The outer ring are subordinate members, my king. Protocol doesn't require. Protocols," Vale said, "require what I say they require." Still mild, still reading. His gaze had not left her. "Who are you?" She was suddenly, acutely aware of the entire pack around her, the density of bodies, the collective held breath. She was aware of Senna 2 ranks ahead, who had gone very still. She was aware of Croft, whose stillness had shifted into something else, something she could not read from the outer ring. She stepped forward, 2 steps, into the narrow lane between her ring and the next. The correct distance for response. "Leodin," she said, "I manage the pack's trade relations and medicinal knowledge. I've been with Dunrath my whole life." "Your whole life?" he said. It was not a question. "Yes, my king." He moved. He walked through the ranks, which also did not happen in well-practiced ceremonies, which also made the collective held breath sharpen into something more taut, and the pack parted for him the way water parts for something dense, and he came through the outer ring and stopped 2 feet from her. Up close, he was more present than he'd been at a distance, which she understood was a quality of dominant wolves and had nothing to do with her. The scent of him reached her. Cedar and cold stone and something underneath. Something darker and warmer, the particular smell of a wolf who had been running a long time in a large territory. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, precisely, without drama, filling it away. "Leodon," he said again, as if testing the weight of it. "What do you do when the pack runs?" The silence around them was absolute. She held his gaze. "I stay," she said, "and I make sure everything worth coming back to is still here when they return." Something moved in his expression, not pity. She'd learned to identify pity with the accuracy of long practice. Something more careful than that. He held out his hand. Not a command, not a dominance gesture. Something older than ceremony, older than protocol, the hand extended between equals, the request for contact rather than its imposition. She looked at it. Later, Maren would say, she hesitated, just a moment. But she did hesitate. Leodon put her hand in his, and the world ended, or rather, the world she had believed in ended. The one she had built with such careful, painful competence over 26 years, the world in which she was the wolfless one, the gap, the exception, the woman who stayed while the pack ran. That world simply stopped being true between one heartbeat and the next. It was not a feeling she had words for, then or later. She tried to describe it once, to Senna, months afterward, and the closest she could come was this. Imagine you've been breathing through a cloth your whole life. Just enough air, just enough. You've adapted so thoroughly you don't remember what full breath feels like. And then someone pulls the cloth away. His hand closed over hers, and something in the deepest, oldest part of her chest cracked open, not metaphorically. Physically, a sensation of something giving way, something yielding, a warmth flooding into a space that had been cold and dark and waiting for 20 years. She felt it move up through her ribs and into her shoulders and down her arms, and she heard for the first time in her life, from the inside of her own body, a sound she had only ever heard from outside it. A wolf, not howling, not loud. The quietest possible sound, barely even a sound, more of a frequency, a vibration she felt in the hinges of her jaw and the backs of her knees. Waking up, her wolf woke up. She could not have described what happened to her face. She did not need to. Maren was 3 feet away and she saw it, and she would describe it to the council later in words that made the room go quiet. But what Leodon felt was, the cold that had lived in her chest for 20 years turned out not to be emptiness. It had been waiting. It had been her, T all along, and it was waking, and it was furious and tender and vast. Vale's hand tightened on hers, his eyes changed. Just slightly. The reading quality went very still, the way water goes still right before something breaks the surface. "There you are," he said, very quiet, just for her. She said nothing, because she was not capable of speech in that moment, and she had the dignity to recognize when words would be insufficient. The pack was watching. Every member of the Dunrath pack, 300 wolves, and the king's own retinue, and the elder who had placed her in the outer ring. All of them watching, and among them, she became aware through the flood of new sensation, through the dazed wonder of having something she'd believed herself permanently denied. She became aware of a sound that was different from the rest of the collective witness. Elder Croft made a sound. It was very small. The sound of a man who has spent a long time being certain and has just had cause to be less so. She heard it. For the first time in 26 years, she had a wolf's hearing. She turned and she looked at him across the gathered pack, and for the first time in her memory he was not still. His hands, folded behind his back since childhood, had come around to his front. He was gripping them together. The knuckles were pale. She filed that away too. The formal ceremony dissolved after that, in the polite, structured way of things that have been overtaken by events more significant than protocol. The king's steward, a sharp-eyed man named Farron who had a gap between his front teeth, wide enough to see from 3 feet away, and who communicated primarily through one raised eyebrow, managed the transition with the competence of someone long accustomed to his employer creating disruptions in formal occasions. Accommodations were made. The visit would proceed, adjusted. Leodon was given a room in the main house instead of the outer hall. Croft watched this happen and said nothing. Senna found her that evening. After the official dinner, she'd sat through in a state of particular internal attention, everything sharper. The smell of the food more complex, the ambient sounds of the hall more layered, her own body feeling subtly and unmistakably different in a way she was still cataloging. Senna knocked on her door and didn't wait for an answer, and came in and closed the door, and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," Leodon said, and then with precision, "No, I don't know." Senna sat on the end of the bed. She was a solid woman, Senna, the kind of solid that comes from years of good physical work, and she had a single streak of gray in her otherwise dark hair that had appeared at 22, and that she'd refused to be bothered by. She looked at Leodon with the directness of someone who had known her since they were 6 years old running on that heather-covered hillside together. One of them shifting, one of them not, and she said, "Your eyes are different, I know." "Gold," Senna said. "They've always been green." "There," she stopped. "Leodon, the whole pack is saying, I know what they're saying. Is it true?" She pressed her thumb against the scar at the base of her hand, the familiar small ridge of it. "Something woke up," she said. "When he touched me, something that's been," she stopped. "I've always felt like there was something missing. You know that. You've known that my whole life." "Yes," Senna said quietly. "It's not missing." She looked at her own hands. "It was there. It was there the whole time and I couldn't." She stopped again. "Why couldn't I feel it?" Senna didn't answer because Senna didn't know. And she was the kind of friend who understood the difference between an honest silence and a false comfort. That was the question that kept Leodon awake. Not the king. Not the ceremony. Not the extraordinary sensation of something alive in her chest for the first time, learning the dimensions of her lungs, the curve of her ribs. That was strange and wonderful and terrifying, and she'd get to it, she'd learn it. She would do with this what she'd done with everything else and become competent at it. But first, why couldn't she feel it? Why had it been silent for 26 years? She went to the window and looked out at the valley, where the pack was running. She could hear them now. Actually hear them, the distant call and response of wolves in the dark. And it opened something in her chest that she had to breathe very carefully around. She had spent 26 years watching them go. She pressed her fingertips against the window glass. Cold, the bite of real mountain cold coming through the old panes. She thought of Croft's hands, gripping each other, the pale knuckles. She thought of the way he'd looked at her on that hillside at 6 years old. Watching her fail to shift, watching it with that particular quality of attention, and she thought about the difference between a man watching something he cannot explain and a man watching something he already knows. She thought, he already knew. She pressed her thumb against her scar and she held that thought, and she let it be as cold and as sharp as it needed to be. She did not go to Croft. She had learned, over years of working within the pack's politics, that the worst time to confront someone was when you were still breathing hard from what they'd done. She went to bed. She slept. Badly, briefly, in 3-hour intervals broken by the new strangeness of her senses, by the way the sounds of the sleeping house came to her in more detail than she'd ever received them. and she woke before dawn, and she went to the PAC's records room. She had the right to be there. She had written a quarter of its more recent documents. She lit a lamp and she began to look. She was not entirely sure what she was looking for. Records of her birth, which she'd seen before and which told her nothing unusual. Records of the elders' proceedings in the weeks around her birth, which she'd never had particular reason to examine. She pulled document after document, working with the precise, unhurried efficiency that was her most fundamental competence, and she laid them out on the long table, and she read. She read for 2 hours, then she found it. It was not labeled clearly. That would have been too convenient, and Croft was not a man who was convenient. It was embedded in the council proceedings of the month she was born, in a section on PAC health matters, written in the slightly different character of Croft's hand from 40 years ago, when he'd been a junior elder and his writing was less controlled. A consultation record. A procedure performed. The word binding appeared 3 times. She sat with that for a long moment. The lamp had been burning long enough that the oil was giving off a slight char smell. When it was almost empty, it did that. A faintly acrid catch underneath the pine resin. She sat in that smell and she read the 3 instances of the word binding. And she thought about 6 years old on a hillside. She thought about every year since. She thought about your nature and the outer ring and 26 years of building a life in a space that should not have needed to be built. She folded her hands on the table. She sat very still for a long time. Then she went and found Farron, the king's steward, and she asked for a meeting. Vale received her in the small study that had been given over to his use. A room she knew well, having used it herself for trade documentation. The maps she'd pinned to the wall 3 months ago were still there, the eastern pass routes marked in her own handwriting. He was standing at the window when she arrived, and he turned when she came in, and he looked at her with that reading quality, and she looked at him with the expression she wore when she was doing the most difficult kind of work. "You found something," he said. "I want to understand the binding procedure," she said. A silence. His expression shifted, not dramatically. He was not a man given to dramatic expression. She was learning, which she appreciated in the abstract and found frustrating in the specific, because she was used to reading people and he was difficult to read. "Where did you find it?" "Council records. My birth month." He moved from the window to the table and sat, which was a thing she noticed. He sat, rather than remaining standing, which leveled something about the geometry of the room. She stayed standing for a moment and then sat across from him, because she was not going to perform a posture she didn't feel. "The binding procedure," she said, "is used in cases of unstable power," he said. "Yes, in children who show signs of power too large or too uncontrolled to develop safely. It suppresses the wolf until the child is mature enough to." He stopped. His jaw worked, once. "It's used in very specific circumstances." "It's not." He stopped again. "It's not supposed to be used for other reasons." She looked at him. "What other reasons?" He looked at the map on the wall. Her handwriting on the eastern pass routes. The particular quality of his looking had something in it she could not name and did not want to assign a word to yet. "Tell me what the record says," he said. She told him. He listened without moving. When she finished, the silence in the room was the kind that carries weight. The lamp between them was the good quality oil. Cedar, she thought, or something close to it, and the small movement of the flame was the only motion in the room. "Croft performed the binding," Vale said. "Yes, on a newborn. Yes, without." He stopped. His hand, on the table, was flat and still. The binding of an infant requires council consensus. It requires documentation of the instability that justifies it. It requires. "The documentation isn't there," she said. "The record only shows the binding itself. Nothing that precedes it, nothing that justifies it." He looked at her. She looked at him. "There's a second document missing," she said. The consultation record references one, a foreseeing record. Someone foresaw something and the binding followed. But I couldn't find the foresight record. Because it was removed, he said. Not a question. Or it was never filed, she said. Which would mean it was private, kept from the council. Which would mean the binding wasn't sanctioned. Which would mean it was illegal, he said. Under pack law. Under my law. The flatness of his voice was more striking than anger would have been. She sat with it. I don't know yet what was foreseen, she said. I know what the outcome was. 26 years of. She stopped. She looked at her hands on the table, the wide palms, the crescent scar. 26 years of believing I was broken. She had not intended to say that. She said it with a precision that surprised her, the way sometimes the most honest things arrive without preparation. She had said it carefully, without drama, and she let it sit in the air between them exactly as it was. He swallowed, twice. We need the foresight record, he said. Yes, she said. And I think you know where to look. Here is what the viewer knows, at this point, that Leodon does not. She has the binding record. She does not have the foresight. She knows Croft suppressed her wolf, and she knows it was illegal. What she does not know is what he saw. What the seer told him, or what he told himself, when he looked at a newborn child and decided that silence was safer than letting her become what she was. She does not know that Croft had a predecessor as elder, a woman named Sable, who held the seat for 30 years and who was known for two things: the precision of her foresights, which were never wrong, and her willingness to document them, even when the documentation complicated her own position. She does not know that Sable's records, when the old elder died, were transferred to Croft's keeping. She does not know that Croft kept them, and she does not know. This is the one the viewer will carry, the one that will matter. She does not know that Farron, the king's steward with the gap-toothed smile and the eloquent raised eyebrow, has been in this territory before. Not this valley, not Dunrath, but this particular shape of situation, a binding, a hidden record, a long-serving elder, a pack that doesn't know what's underneath it. Farron knew. He came here knowing. The question the viewer is holding by now is not whether Croft bound her wolf. The question is whether Vale already knew what was in those records before she walked into his study and told him, whether the king's visit was precisely what it appeared to be, whether his hand extended in ceremony was a choice or a strategy. She trusts him, fully, yet. This is where she makes her one genuine, costly mistake. She trusts him before she has earned the right to. She's been so long without an ally that she walks toward the first person who sees her with both eyes, and she walks with the full, unguarded weight of 26 years of wanting to be seen. It will cost her something real, not what she fears, but something. Vale went to see Croft that afternoon. She was not invited, and she did not go, and this was the thing that would cost her. Not because he did something wrong, but because she let someone else be in the room for the part that mattered most to her. She was in the record room, still working. She had gone back to the documents with the new, specific knowledge of what she was looking for, and she found two more things: a reference to Sable's seal on a secondary document, and a notation in Croft's own hand that said, in the clean administrative language of a man covering his tracks, transferred to personal keeping for safekeeping purposes. Personal keeping. She was sitting with that. The audacity of it, the patient, 26-year audacity of a man who had hidden a document by writing down exactly where it was, trusting that no one would look when Senna came in. Croft is asking for you, Senna said. Her voice was careful. Did the king speak to him? Yes. She looked at her hands. And he's asking for you, Senna said. Leodon. He looks, is a pause. He looks old. She'd known him since she was 6 years old. She'd spent 20 years understanding that he was more dangerous than he appeared. She stood up from the documents and she straightened her clothes, and she pressed her thumb once against her scar, and she went. Croft's study smelled, as it always had, of old paper and pine resin lamp oil. He was sitting behind his table, not standing, not with his hands folded behind his back. He was sitting the way old men sit when something has gone out of them, slightly reduced, the architecture of his certainty visibly altered. He looked at her when she came in. She closed the door and stood in front of it and waited. "I imagined this conversation," he said. His voice was unchanged. That was the thing. His voice was still clear and composed, the voice of a man who had spent 70 years practicing composure. Many times over the years, I had several versions prepared. "And?" she said. "And now that it's here," he said, "I find I don't want to use any of them." She waited. "Sable foresaw it," he said. "When you were born." She came to me. I was a junior elder. It wasn't even my place. She should have taken it to the full council. But Sable never did things the expected way. He looked at the table. She foresaw a bond between the alpha bloodline and a Dunrath female. She said it would be. She used the word seismic. She said it would shift the pack's position in a way that would be irrevocable. That everything we'd built, the arrangements we'd managed, the balances we'd. He stopped. She foresaw that the balance would shift, Liaden said. "And you decided that was a problem." He looked up. There was something in his face that was not quite what she expected, not defiance, not the cold management of a man caught in a wrong. Something more tired than that, more honest in its tiredness, than she'd expected from him. "I decided that stability was more important," he said. "That what we had, what the pack had, the arrangements, the relationships with the lowland villages, the past management, the careful equilibriums, was worth more than a foresight about seismic change." He folded his hands on the table, that gesture, but slower than usual. "I was wrong, not in my reasoning. I still believe stability matters. I was wrong that I had the right to make that choice for you." She looked at him. She had expected several things: excuses, justifications, the elegant legal grammar of a man who had spent decades managing information. She had not expected the plain admission, delivered without grandeur, in the smell of pine resin and old paper in the room where he'd told her to stand in the outer ring. It did not make it better. She wanted to be honest about that. The admission did not reach back 20 years and unstolenize what had been stolen. She looked at him and felt the wolf in her chest, awake and present, and 26 years hungry. And she felt something that was not forgiveness and not fury, but was somewhere in the large, complicated territory between them. "The foresight record," she said. "Where is it?" He reached into the drawer at his right hand. He placed a document on the table between them. Sable's seal, unmistakable, the old elder's mark, the wax cracked at the edges with age. "I've had it for 23 years, he said. "I kept it. I told myself I kept it in case there was a time when the situation changed, when I needed to." He stopped. "I kept it because I couldn't destroy it. That's the truest reason. I couldn't destroy Sable's foresight. I was wrong enough to bind the child. I wasn't wrong enough to burn a true seeing." She looked at the document. She had been trying in the last 24 hours to understand what she would feel when she had it. She had imagined vindication. She had imagined grief. She had imagined the cold clarity of being definitively right. What she felt was something simpler and more essential. She wanted to read it. She wanted to read Sable's words about her, the woman who had seen her before she was born and had been certain enough of what she saw to write it down. She crossed to the table and picked it up. "You'll need the king to release the binding," Croft said. It was placed in concert with the Alpha bloodline's seal. That's why his touch woke it. It's tied to the bloodline. Only the current Alpha King can fully dissolve it. She was already reading. Sable had written in the clear, slanted hand of someone confident in the permanence of words. "I have seen the Dunrath female who will be born in the spring thaw. I have seen the bond she will carry, and I have seen what it will do. She will hold the king's line and the outer pack in the same hand. She is not a bridge. She is a root, What grows from her will not be seismic in the sense of destruction. The child fears the wrong word when she told the elder. It will be seismic in the sense of realignment. What has been arranged by hands will be rearranged by nature. The packs will not lose their equilibriums, they will find better ones. The elder will be afraid of this. I know the shape of his fear. I am leaving this document where he will find it because I want him to choose, knowing what he knows, to let the child be what she is. He will not. But the document will remain. Because the child will need to read it. She read it twice. The second time, her eyes stopped on the last line. Because the child will need to read it. Sable had known. Not just what Croft would do, what the document would become. She had written it for her, specifically. Across 26 years and a binding and a lifetime of believing herself broken, the old seer had left her a letter. She stood in the smell of pine resin and old paper, and she held the document in her wide, strong, scarred hands, and she did the breathing exercise, 4 in, hold, 4 out, because she needed it. Then she put the document inside her coat, against her chest. "I'll need to speak to the king," she said. "Yes," Croft said. She went to the door. Leodin, his voice. The same voice she'd heard all her life. Cold and precise and managed. It was none of those things now. "I can tell you what Sable saw. That it would be good. That it would be. I watched you. All these years. I watched what you built without." He stopped. "I want you to know that I know what I cost you." She stood at the door with her hand on the latch. She did not turn around. "I know that you know," she said. "That's not the same thing as forgiveness." She opened the door and walked out. She found Vale at the eastern gate, where the mountain view was best. The late afternoon light coming through the pass in long gold shafts. The valley below in shadow while the peaks were still bright. He was standing at the wall, looking out, and he heard her coming. He turned before she reached him. She handed him Sable's document without preamble. He read it. His expression did what it had done in the study that morning. That very slight shift, the controlled settling of something. When he finished, he held the document with care, as you hold something old and authoritative, and he looked at her. "The binding is tied to the Alpha bloodline," she said. "Croft confirmed it. You have to dissolve it. Fully." "I know," he said. "You knew about bindings tied to the bloodline," she said. Not an accusation, precision. A brief pause. "Yes, how long have you known one might exist in Dunrath?" The pause was slightly longer. His jaw did the thing she'd seen that morning, the single, controlled working of it. "Farron has been tracking irregular binding records for 3 years," he said. "Across all the pasks, we found patterns." Dunrath was one of several territories flagged. She looked at him. He held her gaze. He did not look away, which she appreciated. He also did not offer an easy shape to what he was telling her, did not wrap it in the kind of framing that would make his prior knowledge more comfortable. He said it plain. "You came here to find the binding," she said. "The ceremony." "Was that? I didn't know who," he said. "I knew it was likely. The pattern, an elder with long tenure, a pack with unusual political stability, no significant challenges to leadership for decades. These are markers. I came to look." A pause. "I didn't know the binding was on a person. I thought it was territorial. There are cases where a pack's wolf sense, they're collective." He stopped. "When I looked at the pack gathered and I felt the suppression, I started reading faces. And I found yours." She absorbed that. She had trusted him before she'd earned the right to. She'd walked into his study and told him everything she'd found, and trusted that his interest in her was what it appeared to be, and his interest in her had not been only what it appeared to be. "Were you going to tell me," she said, "if I hadn't come to you first?" He looked at her. "Yes, you're certain of that." A pause that was, she recognized, the pause of a man being honest rather than comfortable. "I'd like to be certain of that," he said. "I intended to be. Whether I would have in practice." Another pause. "I don't know." She turned and looked at the mountain view. The light was changing, the gold going amber, the shadows in the valley deepening. She could smell the cold coming down from the peaks, and under it the complex animal and smoke smell of the pack village. And under that something she was still learning. The dark cedar warmth that was him. 26 years. And the first man who'd seen her with both eyes had also had a set of reasons for looking. She thought about Sable's document against her chest. She is not a bridge, she is a root. She thought about Croft's hands, gripping each other, the pale knuckles. She thought about the outer ring, where she'd stood in perfect, competent, invisible silence for her entire adult life. "Can you dissolve it now?" she said. "Yes," he said. She turned back to face him. "Then do it," she said. He took a step toward her, closing the gap between outer ring and inner circle. The geography of the ceremony reversed. He raised his hand. She did not step back. He placed his hand over her heart. Not her hand this time. Her chest, the flat of his palm over her sternum, and she felt the alpha bloodline in him like a key meeting, a lock that has been rusted shut for 26 years. And then the lock gave. It was not graceful. She would tell Senna later that it was not graceful at all, that it felt like something breaking open rather than something being freed, which was the truth of it, because you don't cage something for 26 years and release it gently. That is not how captive things come out. The wolf in her rose all at once, not waking this time but claiming, flooding through her from chest to fingertips to the soles of her feet, and she felt her spine straighten with it, and her chin lift and her eyes go gold bright in the fading light. She felt the wolf understand what it was, what it had always been. The size of it, not the smallness she'd been told, was absence, but the fullness of what had been contained. Her knees did not buckle. She'd spent 26 years building the architecture of a person who did not buckle, and the wolf, when it came, did not undo that architecture. It inhabited it. It was at home in the bones of who she'd made herself, in the competence and the discipline and the careful work, and it rose through her like water rising to its own level. And it was home. She was home. She opened her eyes. She'd closed them. She hadn't noticed. And Vale's hand was still at her sternum, and he was watching her with an expression she could read, now, for the first time, because whatever had been reserved in him was not reserved in this moment. What was in his face was something that had been searching for something for a long time, and had found it, and did not quite know yet what to do with the finding. She stepped back. His hand fell. "Thank you," she said. The words were insufficient. She said them anyway. "Liadan, I need to run," she said. "I've never. I need." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, simply, "Go." She went. She shifted at the edge of the village, where the heather began, that same hillside, the same eastern wind, the same light failing in the same direction it had always failed. She was aware of the symmetry of it, and then she stopped being aware of anything except the shift itself, which was nothing like she'd imagined, and everything she'd known it would be. It was not painful. It was the opposite of pain. She came down the hillside on 4 legs in the last gray light, and the pack heard her coming, and they stopped what they were doing, all over the valley. Because she was new, and she was unmistakable. A wolf the color of birch bark in winter, silver white and blazing in the dark, running in the valley for the first time in 26 years of waiting. Senna met her at the tree line. They ran until the stars came out. She did not forgive Croft that night, or the next day, or the day after that. She was not sure forgiveness was the right frame for it, which was a thing she thought about during the long runs she was only beginning to allow herself. The new luxury of motion and scent, and the particular feeling of her wolf's stride finding its own efficient pace. Forgiveness implied an endpoint, a resolution, a document filed and closed. What she had was more complicated and more ongoing than that. Croft was removed from his position as elder. Vale handled this with the authority of pack law, which was absolute on the question of illegal bindings, And he handled it without theatrics, which she appreciated. There was no public humiliation, no ceremony of censure, just a formal proceeding and a formal removal. And the particular loudness of a man who had held authority for decades sitting in the hall during the pack dinner. In a chair that was no longer the head chair, she saw him look at her once during that dinner. She looked back. She did not smile. She did not look away. She looked at him with her gold eyes and her 26 years of evidence, and she let him see what she had become in the week since the king had touched her hand, and she let him sit with the fact that this, what she was right now, had been available the entire time, that she had always been this, that he had known. He looked away first. The pack noticed. The whole hall noticed. Marin, 3 feet away at the next table, noticed, and would describe it to the council later with the steady voice and the unsteady hands. There were things between her and Vale that were not resolved by the unbinding. She would be honest about this. The chemistry between them. The thing that had been present from the moment he'd read her face across the ceremony and called her forward. That had been escalating in the particular way of things that both parties are aware of and neither has named. That was not resolved by his hand on her sternum or her running in the valley or the formal proceedings against Croft. It was, if anything, more present for all of that. More specific. He stayed 3 weeks in Dunrath. Protocol required 10 days. He found reasons. She pretended not to notice he was finding reasons, which was dishonest of her, and she knew it. But she was also doing something she had never had to do before in this domain, which was learning to trust a reading of a situation. While knowing her reading instrument was new, her wolf had been awake for 3 weeks, her sense of him, of what he meant and wanted and withheld. She was learning it in real time, and she was not going to move faster than her competence. She had spent 26 years building competence in absence. She was not going to abandon precision now that she had something to be precise about. He understood this, or he appeared to. This was the thing about him that she was still negotiating, the question of what was strategic patience and what was genuine restraint. He gave her space in a way that felt like respect and might have been calculation and was probably both, and she gave him the same in return, and they were extremely careful with each other for 3 weeks, in the way of people who are aware that what they're carrying is breakable. The near touch came on the 12th day, when she was reviewing the trade documents she'd been updating. New balances, new relationships to account for, the political geometry of the pack having shifted. And he came to the record room to return the documents she'd lent him, and they were both reaching for the edge of the same map, and their fingers came within a breath of each other, and they both stopped. The room was very quiet. She could smell the cedar and cold stone of him from 6 inches away, overlaid with something she was still learning, the particular quality of his wolf close to the surface. Her own wolf was attentive in a way that was distinct from threat attention, the way a key is attentive to its lock. He pulled his hand back. She pulled hers back. The Eastern Pass arrangement, she said. Yes, he said. They went back to the documents. She lay awake for an hour that night before her wolf pulled her under. The line that got crossed was not what she expected. She had expected, if she was honest, something more conventionally dramatic, a declaration, a confrontation, a scene. What happened was quieter than that, as the important things in her experience tended to be. He was leaving the following morning. She had known for 2 days and had been doing a very thorough job of not thinking about it, which had manifested as an extremely productive series of administrative tasks that Senna had observed with visible skepticism. He found her in the evening on the hillside where she'd stood at 6 years old. She had gone there deliberately, in the same way she went back to the site of old wounds to check whether they'd healed. He had followed, or found her. She was not sure which, and in the moment it did not matter. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. The valley was below them, the heather pressing at their ankles, the wind from the east, his profile in the fading light. That jaw scar she still didn't know the full story of. "When I came here," he said, "I came looking for a binding. That's the truth. And when I found you in the ceremony and I extended my hand..." He stopped. He did this, the controlled stop, the decision about what came next, and she'd learned to read it as a man choosing words carefully rather than a man hiding. Part of that was strategy, testing whether the alpha bloodline would activate on contact. I want you to know I know that's not the entire story of that moment, but it's in the story, and you deserve to know it's there. She looked at the valley. "I know," she said. A pause. "You knew. I figured it out. Not immediately, but yes. And you? You still told me the truth when I asked you directly," she said. "You told me you'd intended to be honest but weren't certain you would have been. That's not nothing." She turned to look at him. "You did one disappointing thing and then you were honest about it. That's a better record than most." He looked at her with the reading quality she'd become accustomed to, except that now she could see what was underneath it. The thing the reading was in service of, which was the same thing she was in service of, she suspected, which was making sure what was here was real. "The fated bond," he said. "You know it's real. You can feel it." "Yes," she said. "That's not why," he said. "I want you to understand that. The bond is, it's there, it's real, I'm not." He stopped, started again. "I'm not claiming you because of it. I'm standing on this hillside in the dark because I read your face in a ceremony, and I wanted to know who you were, and I found out, and I'd like to keep finding out." A pause. "If you want that." She looked at him. She thought about Sable's words. "She is not a bridge. She is a root." She thought about 26 years of useful, careful, invisible competence. She thought about the scar at her thumb and the cold window glass, and all the times she'd said, "I know, ma'am," and meant, "Then why does it feel like less?" She thought about Senna, who had run beside her in the valley under the stars. She thought, "I have earned the right to want something." "Yes," she said. He reached out and she took his hand, and it was not a ceremony, and it was not a strategy, and the wolf in her chest was very quiet. The way something is quiet when it is exactly where it belongs. She had spent 26 years in the outer ring. She stepped out of it now, here, on the hillside where the heather grew in dense purple mats, and the wind came from the east, and she did it herself. No one placing her anywhere. That was the thing that mattered. That she stepped. What came after was not the end of anything. She would tell you that herself if you asked her. She stayed in Dunrath for another month, long enough to see the new elder arrangement settled. The council selected a woman named Orla, 48 years old with a scar on her collarbone, and a habit of asking the question everyone else was avoiding, which made her immediately and correctly trusted. Long enough to complete the revised trade documentation. Long enough to sit with Senna in the heather on a warm afternoon and not say very much, because Senna was the kind of friend you didn't need to perform for, which was its own kind of enormous wealth. She left in early summer. She did not leave because she was claimed or summoned. She left because there was work at Caer Moran that she had identified, and that no one else was currently doing. The review of binding records across all 7 packs. The work of finding whose else had been silenced in the name of stability. Who else was standing in an outer ring, believing themselves broken when they were only bound? Farron met her at the main gate of the city, with his one raised eyebrow, and what she was coming to understand was his version of a warm welcome. And she found herself absurdly and genuinely glad to see him. Vale she found, at the end of the day, in the records hall, bent over the same kind of documentation she'd been reviewing for 6 hours. He looked up when she came in. He did not perform surprise or not surprise. He just looked at her with the reading quality that was. She understood now simply how he looked at the world, and at her most of all. "Dunrath's records are sorted," she said. "Good," he said. "Caer Moran's are a disaster." "I know," she said. I looked at the inventory on the road. He raised an eyebrow. You asked Farron for the inventory. He offered it. Of course he did. Something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the family of one. You're going to reorganize the entire hall. Yes, she said. How long? She looked at the stacks of documents, the years of accumulated imprecision, all the places where what was true had been buried under what was convenient. As long as it takes, she said. He looked at her. She looked back, gold eyes in the lamplight, silver-white braid over one shoulder, the wide hands that had always been her mother's hands and were now finally also hers. All right, he said. She sat down and she began to work. There is one thing I haven't told you. Croft, in his removal, was permitted to stay in Dunrath as a pack member without authority. Pack law allows this. He is old and the pack is not cruel, and his years of stability management, whatever their cost, had kept the village fed and the passes managed. And the new elder Orla made a decision that Liadan thought was right, even as it cost her something to acknowledge, that the harm he did and the good he did were both real, and the pack was large enough to hold both. She did not see him again before she left. But Senna told her later what happened the evening after Liadan's departure. Senna was at the eastern gate when the pack ran, the evening run, all 300 of them, and Croft stood at the wall and watched. He had always watched from the wall. He was a man who managed, who oversaw, who held the mechanisms rather than running in them. That evening, Senna said, he shifted. No one had seen him shift in years. No one knew, even if he still could. He was 73, and some wolves that old find the shift too costly and let it go. But that evening he shifted, and he was a gray wolf, old and spare, and he ran down the hillside after the pack, at a pace that was not fast and did not try to be. The pace of a wolf at the edge of its capacity, running anyway. He did not catch them. He didn't try. He just ran, in the same valley where he'd spent decades managing the lives of wolves he would not run with, and what he thought about out there in the dark, nobody knows. Senna told Liadan this, and Liadan sat with it for a long time. She did not say what she thought. She let it be what it was. What I know is this. Liadan's wolf is 26 years hungry, and it is running now, in a large territory, with good company and more to come. Sable's foresight is filed correctly in the records hall at Caer Moran, catalogued and cross-referenced, available to anyone who needs to find it. Croft's binding is dissolved and his name is in the illegal binding records, which are now, finally, systematically, being compiled. And somewhere in the documents she is still working through, Liadan found a notation, in Sable's clear slanted hand, that she has not shown Vale yet. A second foresight, different from the first. She knows what Sable was watching for. She does not know yet what Sable saw. She will. But the child who needed to read it has not been born.